My name is Kristen Johnson, and I serve as the Director of Diversity and Equity here at Lone Star College-Kingwood. We're so happy you could join us this evening for this event. This event was originally scheduled for February during Black History Month, but due to the winter storm, we unfortunately had to cancel it, and now we've rescheduled. And it's very ironic that today would be the day we would have this conversation. I hope some of you all have been able to watch the news or read it and see an historical event that's happened today. And I don't want to go into too much details, but I think today is a start. There's still a long ways to go, but I have a little hope that maybe our justice system will change. And so I'm excited that Dr. Crystal Edwards is here with us from the University of Houston, who is going to talk more with us about the talk and the conversations that many Black families have to have in their households. And so I want to share a little bit about her, and then I'll hand it over to her. But just for a few housekeeping duties, tonight when we get to the Q&A, which will be after Dr. Edwards speaks, I would like you all to use the chat feature, and you can put questions in there throughout the talk, and I will make sure that we get to them at the end. But that is how you will ask your questions to the presenter tonight. So let me go ahead and introduce Dr. Edwards. After earning her BS in political science with a minor in African American Studies from the University of Houston, Dr. Crystal Edwards attended the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where she earned her PhD in Africology with a concentration in urban education. Dr. Edwards is currently a lecturer in the African American Studies program at the University of Houston and an independent contractor working on various student affairs projects at Prairie View A&M University. Her most recent book publications are the co-edited text African Americans in Higher Education, a critical study of social and philosophical foundations of Africana culture. Her first book project, Black Girls Experiencing Their Intersectional Identities in Schools, and her article entitled Critical Approaches to Urban Education, Shifting Culturally Dominant Understandings of Teaching, Learning, and the Purpose of Schooling. Her various publications center the subjective experience of African Americans within the educational context. Dr. Edwards' research and teaching interests include African American history and culture, lived experiences of Black women and girls, intersectionality, microaggressions, Black feminisms, and Africana theories and methodologies. Please help me welcome Dr. Crystal Edwards.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for having me this afternoon. Before we get started, I'm going to go straight into the presentation, and then we will continue our talk. Blown through some of the time, I'm going to go ahead and skip the video that I wanted to show, but ultimately there's a video that was on the site. It was a Times op-ed documentary piece that was discussing some of the conversations and the ways that it feels to have these conversations with their Black children. And it also had some older gentlemen and older women who were actually discussing their own interpretation and reflection on having those talks. So, I'll get into the discussion now. So first, I just want to thank you all again for bearing with me and allowing me to come and speak with you all. When I was initially planning this presentation in January and February, I was prepared to discuss some of the various talks that Black parents, be it grandparents, aunts, uncles, godparents, or community elders, have with their Black children. I actually initially intended to focus on various subjects, including appropriate dress, church etiquette, the birds and the bees, etc. I wanted to highlight some of the culturally specific conversations we have and discuss the context of those conversations. But in the current climate and the current events, even the events that just happened today, we're literally in the midst of history unfolding, I feel obligated to focus on a discussion on a talk that Black elders have with youth of their communities. A conversation that has been prevalent dating back to enslavement through emancipation and Jim Crow Reconstruction, as well as up until today. So my first memory with the talk was from my grandfather, and I call him my pawpaw. And when I was in high school, I began to start my transition into an age where I could drive and I was becoming more independent. He sat me down and he said, Tiny, now if you ever get stopped by the police, stay calm and be sure to use yes, sir, no, sir. Always keep your insurance card and registration in the visor, not in the glove compartment. Keep your hands on the steering wheel, visible at all times, and always ask before you reach to grab anything. And of course, at that time, being a young person, I laughed it off and said, okay, Papa. And which was my typical response to my grandpa giving me his lectures. But little did I know that I would see the reason for this talk play out in videos time and time again, 10 years later. This talk that Black parents have with their children is what I want to focus on this evening. I'll give a historical context of policing in America and discuss the societal message that undergirds the need for these types of conversations. Next slide. So this just brings me, I just wanted to highlight this quote that states, our police force was not created to serve Black Americans. It was created to police Black Americans and to serve white Americans. Next slide. So I'm going to start with giving some statistics by the numbers. So based on a Pew Research Center survey done in 2019, 84% of Black adults said that in dealing with police, Blacks are generally treated less fairly than whites. 63% of whites said the same. Similarly, 87% of Blacks and 61% of whites said the US criminal justice system treats Black people less fairly. In the same study, we find that Black adults are about 5 times as likely as whites to say they've been unfairly stopped by police because of their race or ethnicity. A research study done by Frank Edwards, Hedwig Lee, and Michael Esposito, utilizing data on police-involved deaths between 2013 and 2018, conclude the following. Black men are about 2.5 times more likely to be killed by the police over their life course than are white men, and Black women are about 1.4 times more likely to be killed by police than are white women. Among all groups, Black men and boys face the highest lifetime risk of being killed by police. Also, the police use of force is responsible for 1.6% of all deaths involving Black men between the ages of 20 years of age and 24 years of age. In the last 10 years, there have been many other studies that have come to similar conclusions, that Black Americans face the most racial bias in policing and excessive use of force by the police. Furthermore, Black Americans are far more likely to experience a fatal police encounter. So one might ask, with the plethora of quantitative data, what is being done to combat this epidemic? So as I would tell my students, there is nothing new under the sun. So first, we must understand the history that has created this issue to better find a solution. Next slide. So now I want to talk about the history of policing, and specifically how the history of policing is inherently connected and intertwined to racism in the United States. So the English influence in the 18th century is what the early policing of American urban centers kind of copied, right? They used that as their model. And particularly northern states were largely influenced by the model of policing established in London, England through the Metropolitan Police Act of 1829. The functions in the North primarily centered on maintaining basic societal functions, enforcing local government and policies, and ultimately just maintaining law and order. But as scholar Robert Brown asserts, law enforcement evolved differently in the South and frontier, and the conditions and traditions of these regions are important parts of the fabric of American policing. In these areas, policing also had to deal with the realities associated with the institution of slavery, particularly the threats of revolts, escapes, and longstanding and also look to uphold that longstanding ideal of white supremacy. The slave patrols was the first distinctly American police system, and it set the pattern of policing that Americans of African descent would experience throughout their history in America. Both enslaved and freed African Americans were at the mercy of slave patrols that beat and terrorized African Americans throughout the South. Scholar Gary Porter asserts that the three main functions of patrols were to, one, chase down, apprehend, and return their owners, runaway slaves. Two, to provide a form of organized terror to deter slaves' revolts. And three, to maintain a form of discipline for slave workers who were subject to summary justice outside the law. American policing throughout the 19th century, we see that modernization led to an expansion of policing in defense of economic interests and the elites. So as capitalism and economic inequality continues to grow, the need for organized police force continued to grow as well. Potter adds, the modern police force not only provided an organized, centralized body of men, and they were all male, legally authorized to use force to maintain order, it also provided the illusion that this order was being maintained under the rule of law, not at the whim of those with the economic power. So now we follow into the Civil War and emancipation, and we see the establishment of Black codes, which were restrictive laws created to limit the freedom of newly freed slaves post-emancipation, right? Black codes were also established to ensure a free or cheap source of labor post the abolishment of slavery. For example, under Black codes, many states required Black people to sign yearly labor contracts, and if they refused, they risked being arrested, fined, and forced into unpaid labor. Throughout Reconstruction, these policies remained in place to limit Black freedom. African Americans were subject to strict vagrancy laws. Black people who refused to accept or conform to the laws were routinely arrested, beaten, and subjected to forced labor. So all of these things, the ultimate goal brings us back to the forced labor, which is still that is replacing that free labor of enslavement. Ultimately, lawmakers, especially in the southern states, increased the acts punishable by incarceration. So by the end of the 1800s, Black Americans made up 70% of the prison population. So as we move from the Reconstruction era, spanning from the end of Reconstruction through the Civil Rights Movement, we see the emergence of a legal system of racial segregation that stretched through schools, public facilities, transportation, water fountains, restrooms, and this was considered the Jim Crow era. So in 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson and solidified the legality of racial separation. This is where we get this idea of separate but equal, which is inherently unequal. Throughout the 20th century, Jim Crow laws persisted. Lynching and race riots also drastically increased. And so we see that in the South in particular, lynching was the modus operandi, right? And so we see that was another means of policing the Black community through terror and fear. So it's important to note that the Jim Crow laws were not limited to Southern states. In the North, there were similar laws, such as the requirement of African Americans to own property before they could vote. Despite the fact that there was a prevalence of segregated neighborhoods, there was a prevalence of segregated schools and businesses. So the access to the means in order to own property were still very much so segregated and limited to white only. As we move on to Nixon's war on drugs, as the civil rights movement gained steam in their efforts to combat Jim Crow and racial violence in the 1970s, President Nixon calls for a war on drugs / a war on crime. And many scholars have identified that the targets of this war was disproportionately Black power activists, members of the Black community, as well as other organizations that were considered to be liberal or left. Following Nixon's war on drugs or war on crime, we see President Reagan get tough on drugs. And so by 1986, Ronald Reagan signs into law the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. The law imposed mandatory sentencing for drug-related crimes. You received severe penalties and mandatory minimum prison sentences. So we also see that there were some significant racial undertones in the disparity of sentencing. For example, there were longer prison sentences were established for offenses involving the same amount of crack cocaine, which is considered to be often used by Black Americans, as powder cocaine, used more often by white Americans. And it wasn't until 2010, with the passing of the Fair Sentencing Act, that we see even a reduction in this discrepancy. We don't see equality, but we see a reduction in the discrepancy. So throughout the 20th and 21st century, we have continued to see racial disparity in policing, i.e. stop and frisk, racial profiling, as well as incarceration rates, i.e. the prison industrial complex. So that brings us to the discussion of solutions, right? Because anytime I have a conversation identifying a challenge or identifying a problem, I always like to engage with, well, what are some pragmatic strategies or solutions to this problem? And now that we have a better understanding of the historical antecedents of modern policing in America, the topics of solutions can actually be broached. The history of policing in America reveals the foundation of both institutional and structural racism. Policing in America has historically been a means of suppression and punishment and terror for people of color, especially African Americans. With that being said, it's only reasonable for one to surmise that a fundamental overhaul of the ideas and practices is necessary to combat the racist foundation. Miriam Kaba asserts that historically, efforts to quote-unquote reform American policing through identifying and punishing misconduct or providing more funding for sensitivity training has been ineffective. So what do the social media campaigns calling to abolish the police or defund the police mean? So for one, quite literally, they are calling to abolish policing in America as we know it. So as we've discussed in the earlier parts of my presentation, policing in America was fundamentally and has fundamentally been used to control through fear, intimidation, and violence the actions of African descended people. As such, the existing system is in essence serving its historical function, right? So therefore, the function of policing in America cannot be changed without a radical reimagining of the overall purpose of policing. For example, in places like Minneapolis, that we see a lot of things that are going on right now, community activists are calling for the dismantling of the existing police force and the creation of a new, quote unquote, Department of Community Safety and Violence Prevention. Another point that we see with the calls to defund or to abolish the police is a scaling back of police force and allocating these funds to community organizations and social service providers. Advocates have rallied for a significant decrease in the size and scope of police force and responsibilities. So keep in mind that 9 out of 10 police calls are for nonviolent events. Reallocating funds to community organizations and social service providers would inevitably address some of the larger issues plaguing society. For example, mental illness, homelessness, and addiction. Community activists have long argued that addressing the issues of public safety and crime can be better resolved by addressing the problems that are at the root. In a similar vein, Scholars and activists have called for the decriminalization of behavior that disproportionately leads to arrest and imprisonment of people of color. So Coyne, as I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the prison industrial complex, how the way in which the marginalization and the oppression and the direct impact of particular legislation disproportionately impacts African Americans and other people of color. We have again this conversation of the prison industrial complex, which was a term coined by legal scholar Michelle Alexander, which is basically the criminal justice system is reproducing enslavement or the goal of free labor, and also maintaining and reproducing disparity, recognizing that it's a structural issue. So this quote by James Baldwin, he's one of the preeminent scholars when we talk about Black history and social justice. So he has this quote, says, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And ultimately, the message that undergirds this talk, right, that Black parents and parents of color have to have with their children, is a message that there are two different Americas, right? Fundamentally, our parents are telling their children that we live in a society in which there are multiple realities based on your proximity to whiteness, and that we must act accordingly. And it's not because they're trying to tell us these things to fit in, or in order to be accepted more largely, or to integrate into the larger society, but it's actually as a means of survival. We have seen time and time again, African American people, we have seen what happens with some of these encounters with African American people in law enforcement. We have seen that oftentimes it can become fatal. We hear the responses and the reactions to the raw emotions of people in the streets, and some problematize the response by focusing on property damage and looting. Others urge protesters to organize in a more peaceful way to be heard. But when we look to the historical examples of fights that resulted in freedom, liberation, and equity, most revolutions have been violent. Ultimately, people are calling for an overhaul of the system. People are frustrated and angered by the countless instances of police brutality and fatality. Change cannot wait. A solution must be identified and implemented now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edwards. I think it helped to have that historical context and to really bring to light, how we got to where we are today. So at this time, we'll go ahead and open it up for questions. So if anyone has a question, please put it in the chat, and we will go from there. So I'll start since I don't see one in the chat. Obviously, today we saw, the verdict come down in the Derek Chauvin case. 3 counts of guilty on all the charges. And so I've seen a lot of people on social media going back and forth. Some people saying this is justice. Other people saying, no, this is holding someone accountable. We shouldn't be excited or find joy in the fact that someone was held accountable for their actions. I would be curious to hear your thoughts. And, do you feel one way or another? Do you feel like justice was served today?
That's a great question. Just like the rest of the world, I was sitting in front of the television watching in anxious, the anxious energy. I was watching the verdict. And I think there's a combination of feelings for me, at least. There's a combination of feelings. Like, one, yes, this is a person being held accountable. This is what accountability looks like, right? But then the other side of me, I guess, thinking of the history and even looking at the past few years, right? And the number of instances of fatalities, of police involved shootings that we see very limited consequences, right? And just earlier, I was having a conversation with my sister, and we were talking about the fact that, you know, oftentimes people are not able to expect justice through the criminal justice system, right? But we can expect that there may be some type of civil case or a civil reward, right? And it almost gives you that sense that monetarily we can give you this amount of money in exchange for the life of your loved one, right? Which is a very unfortunate and unsettling idea in my perspective. So I guess for me, it's like, you know, yes, this person was held accountable, but it also kind of highlights the larger issue in American society, which is the fact that we can't expect accountability. So because we don't expect accountability, we are so overjoyed when someone finally has to be accountable for murdering us. So then what does that say? Like, to me, that's a larger conversation about the fact that so we can't expect accountability. This is a one-off, and we're happy about it. And I think that we should be happy about it, but I think there's still a lot more work that's going to need to be done in addressing the structural realities and in addressing the fundamental components of policing in America that creates this reality, that creates a reality that we rejoice and we are relieved when one person has to be accountable for their actions and for murdering us. But there's so many of us. When I was preparing for this talk, I was just kind of looking through stuff online, and I stumbled upon a website that actually has the faces and the information of each Black person that has been killed through police interaction, as a result of police interaction. And it also indicates if it was through another type of means, right? But it's pages and pages and pages, and it goes back through years, through like the last 10, 15 years. And there's just so many instances of police interactions that resulted in a fatality. And so for me, it's hard to be excited about one victory, if we can call it a victory, right? It's hard to be excited about that one victory because there are all of these other instances where justice has not been served. And then it brings me to the question of, well, is this going to be the one? Was he allowed to be the example? Or will we continue to see, is this a change in tide, a change in the way that we operate, a change in the justice system that is now saying, okay, you will be held accountable, right? And so to me, that's the conversation the internal dialogue that I have. And for me, it's a very complicated mix of emotions.
Thank you for that. Our second question is, should we encourage our Black children to join the police force?
So, I mean, that's a twofold answer, right? So there's pros and cons, right? One of the pros is that if we go by this idea that the more of us that are in leadership positions in these organizations, the more likely it is for us to be able to change the ways in which people operate, right? And we have a direct way of holding folks accountable. But then simultaneously, we have seen that joining a defunct system, joining a problematic a structure that is fundamentally flawed does not necessarily lead to a change in that system, right? So if there is if we envision this radically different policing, this way of policing in America, right? And we say yes, then yeah, it's a great idea to have children from all different ethnicities participating in the creation of this new thing. But joining a system that's already defunct is not in and of itself going to improve the outcomes, right? We also see multiple instances where sometimes it's police of color who are engaging in these problematic behaviors. And so sometimes us joining systems doesn't result in a change of the system, it results in a change of us.
A great point. Okay, so this question I think is maybe a two-part question. So of all the potential solutions you cover, which do you most favor? Let's start with there, and then I'll go into the other part of the question.
Okay. I always consider myself to be more on the radical end of things. And I do feel like there has to be, whenever people are saying abolish the police, that's literal, right? Abolish policing as we know it. Abolish the American policing system as we know it. At this point, it's not possible to sift through identifying the goods and the bads. We know what's necessary to police communities, right? We know what's necessary to improve and to address some of the larger issues that plague society. We know how there's so much research done on criminality, so we know some of the factors that undergird criminality. So this current system that we have, it's fundamentally flawed, right, at the core. And so I am more of a proponent for abolishing the existing system and policing as we know it, right? Because allocating funds is great, and that's absolutely necessary, and we would see that as a result of changing this system that is currently in place.
So you touched on abolishing police forces, and that was the second part of the question. Could you elaborate more on what would take their place? And then second part, would demilitarizing the police make a difference? Why or why not?
So I'll address the second part of the question first, and then I'll go back to the first part of the question. So yes, I do think that demilitarizing the police would absolutely make a difference, right? But then it brings us back to the reality that militarization of the police is inherent in the way that we conceive American policing, right? That is part of the structure, part of the core fabric. And so it's almost like we can't demilitarize the police and still call it the same police, right? Because there's other ideas and there are other aspects of policing that would necessarily need to be changed altogether. And for me, abolishing the police, it doesn't look like a lack of policing, right? It doesn't look like a lack of structures to maintain and support law and order, right? It doesn't look like a free-for-all where everyone just does what they want and it's going to be vigilante justice running rampant, right? And I don't think that that's what anybody who says abolish the police. Abolishing the police is at the most basic of levels, shifting what we consider to be policing in America. So it's creating something radically different, radically new, and it could very well look like a combination between community watch style, you know what I mean, community watch style policing. We police ourselves a lot, right? In our communities, we watch out for our neighbors watch out for us. If we see something weird happening on the camera, we may or may not contact our neighbor and say, hey, I just saw this happening, are you good? There is already, we already have an idea of the things that we feel need to be necessary when it comes to policing. And I also think that there is definitely space for there to be a federal organization of policing, right? But it just would have to be something completely different than what we currently have in place, especially understanding the history.
Okay. I kind of want to move back to the verdict that happened today. There's a question regarding it. Do you feel that there will be backlash with respect to this verdict? In the back of my mind, part of me wonders what will the response be from those who are in power who are hoping for a not guilty verdict?
I think that's a great question, especially thinking about what happened in January as a result of the election, right? And thinking about the fact that there have been these attempts at armed insurrection as a result of not receiving of a group of people not receiving the outcome that they actually wanted and that they desired. I think it's possible that there can be some backlash. I also think that in my mind, in some ways, it feels like those that are actually in power, that this is actually the outcome that they desired. And they desired this outcome because think about what would have happened, right? If this whole trial happens and we see the lack of defense, really, for what was done, we see a lack of, from my perspective, sorry, I have dogs. And we have a lack of, give me a second. Okay, so as we see a lack of, we would have seen a lack of response. You know, after all of this stuff that we see, we all watched this together. Sorry. I guess he wanted to be heard. So we see if all of this would have happened and nothing, and it came back not guilty, imagine the uproar that would have happened. Imagine the response. And so for me, I almost feel like those in power they wanted this response to maintain a certain level of peace within these communities across the world. Not only that, but also to reinforce some of those people who may be on the edge of whether or not they believe in the ability for the current justice system to actually dish out justice, right? So some people who were on the edge them having this verdict may have then reinforced their belief that, okay, the justice system does in fact work. Now, whether or not I think that that's what this means, that's a whole different conversation. But I think that those that are actually in power, that this is in fact the outcome that they hope for.
Okay, another question. How do we tell our sons the right way to deal with cops? But in reality, there's no right way. No matter what he does, he will always be viewed as a criminal.
I think you answered your own question. And I think it's for both our sons and daughters, right? We know that unfortunately these outcomes and these experiences are not relegated to only males experiencing these fatal encounters with police. We have countless numbers of Black women who have also experienced fatality in an interaction with police. I think if we're going with this existing system, the best that one could say, the best that one could do is give the conversation that my grandfather gave to me, which is basically behave in a certain way, maintain a certain decorum, don't reach for anything. It's very interesting that I almost feel like now I have more anxiety in interactions with police than I used to have 10, 15 years ago, whenever I was getting this lecture from my grandpa, right? I almost feel like now there's more anxiety dealing with a cop. And my now go-to is I'm putting someone on the phone, I'm getting someone on the phone with me, hoping that we can record what's going on, and I'm keeping conversations to a minimum. But I'm still hands on the wheel, don't make any sudden moves. Now we keep our insurance cards on our phones and things like that. And so it's communicating the whole entire time. Is it okay if my insurance card is on my phone? I need to get my driver's license. It's in my wallet. Things like that are, I guess, the best that we could are like the best things that we can do in this existing system. Because unfortunately, there is no answer to deal with someone who is inherently afraid of your existence. You are a threat, no matter what. And so it's very, I think it's very disheartening, right? To think through the reality that there's almost not much we can do besides prepare them for the possibility and the very real, the very real chance that they are going to have an interaction with police. And then all we can do is whatever, depending on your spiritual or religious affiliation, all you can do is pray that it doesn't turn fatal.
Edwards, I have to agree with you in terms of being more anxious now. I can, remember growing up and not thinking anything of it when I got pulled over at 20. But as recently as last week, my husband and I were driving and we were pulled over. And when the officer came to the window, we saw that he was Black. And after we left and got the ticket, I told my husband, I said, is it bad that when I saw the officer walk up and I saw that he was Black, there was a sense of relief that came over me?
I think
the people who are supposed to protect us,
yes,
are the same people we're afraid of.
Exactly. And then, back to the historical reality is that that's how it's always been, right? The system has never been, the system was not built to protect us, right? And I would say I would have similar emotions and similar feelings with regards to maybe sometimes being more relieved when it is a Black police officer, but still sometimes those instances don't end up the best. I will say that if it's a Black police officer that I'm pulled over by, as a woman, I feel that I feel a little bit more relieved, right? But if I have my, my brother with me, or, one of my nephews with me, I'm still just as anxious, right? Because it can easily turn.
Absolutely. So there's a question. If I'm understanding the question correctly, it's basically saying if a new police force was created, how do you keep the corrupt police from joining the new system that's created? How do you weed them out?
So I think that's a really good question, and I think that a lot of it is about the same way that there's checks and balances, the same way that there is accountability. That this idea, there should also be training, right? You go to law school, right, to understand the law. In order to be a lawyer, you have to go to years and years and years and years of school. But in order to become a police officer, you don't have to have a degree. And so the question becomes one of, okay, so who are you attracting to these positions? And what would happen if you required a greater level of certification or credentials in order to serve in these roles, right? And then it's also about just the same way that we have to get these standard, the same way, with customer service, right? Customer service, you get these surveys once you have these interactions with people. There should be some way that the community members can discuss and can reflect on how they felt about their interaction with a particular police officer. I think that if there were more means of evaluation, specifically by the communities in which these people are supposed to serve, then that would start to prevent some of the negative interactions. If there were real world consequences for a citizen reporting that you had mistreated them, that you had mishandled them, or that you had done something out of the way that things are supposed to be handled. There has to be more citizen influence, and there has to be more citizen's voice when it comes to policing.
So I think that's I don't know how many departments, but I do know that there are police departments that have oversight boards, and they review complaints that come in from citizens. But I'm wondering, are police departments doing a good job of communicating that to the community, that there are people who are looking at the body cam video who are penalizing these officers? What are they being penalized with? Are they being fired? Are they being given days off? What does that look like? I don't think police departments, if they have them in place, have done a good job of communicating that with the community, that there is in fact people in place. And do they have the right people on their boards that look like the community that they're a part of, or that they're making decisions?
And I think that's a really good point, because when we think about the Black Power movement, a lot of people have these negative affiliations, these negative thoughts associated with the Black Panther Party and things like that. And one of the things that we see when we talk about the civil rights movement, as we move into the Black Power movement, we see this increase in policing the police, right? In citizens watching what is happening in these moments. And that brings the point home of accountability and the ways in which accountability is needed. And it's not enough for there to be only some departments that have these review boards, right? That kind of is the point. It's part of the problem, right? There is no accountability because there is nobody to hold them accountable. And so I think that brings the point of, that's what we need. That's any new policing system has to fundamentally be in the interest of citizens, and citizens have to have a means of communicating and holding folks accountable.
Okay, so I have two more questions. I feel like I just have to ask. So if you don't mind, I know we're kind of running over time. So the first question is, what are your ideas about officers having to maintain insurance, like teachers, plumbers, other career fields? Is this realistic?
Can you clarify that question? So what do you mean in maintain insurance?
So let's see what the person said. Okay, I wanted to end on this question. Let me see if I'll give them a chance to type. Pay for insurance as we do.
So like health.
I'm not sure. I'm wondering if like maybe have alerts when there are too many incidents. So I'm
like so creating an insurance plan similar to how if we have like with car insurance, right? If we have too many accidents, then the costs continue to go up and higher and higher and higher. And then at a certain point, our insurance can drop us if we have too many incidents. I think something similar to that could be possible. I mean, I think what it really comes down to is that we're talking about accountability, right? We're talking about consequences, right? So there absolutely must be something inherent within any policing system that allows for or that mandates accountability as well as consequences and serious consequences for breaches in the way in which they are supposed to be policing.
Okay. And so the last question, it's related to a previous question, but I think it's a good one to end on. In your mind, did it make a difference that Donald Trump was not president on this day this historic verdict came down? If so, please elaborate.
I mean, I guess that him not being president currently, he would have obviously taken that he would have used that as a personal talking point, and he definitely would have somehow connected himself to the outcome and how it was considered to be a positive outcome, right? So I guess in that regard, but these days, to be honest, I don't really think of Donald Trump very much. And so that's not even a thought that even came into my mind. I don't know if we can quite say that this is a historical moment because we have to see what happens after the fact, right? We have to see if this is setting a precedent that this will become the modus operandi. If it's just a moment, then to me, I don't necessarily see what the historical significance is. But if this changes the way that things move going forward, then to me, that makes it a historical moment. So only time will tell whether or not this is even a significant historical moment as we would like to think that it is.
I think this has been a great discussion. You gave great historical context to where we are today. And, it's my hope that, 15 years from now, I don't have to have this conversation with my Black son.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that his reality is not what our reality is right now. And like you said, only time will tell. So, I guess take today as a victory, but there's so much more to the story.
Yes, one hurdle, and we have many more. But as if nothing else, we know from history that Black folks and people of color, we're resilient, and that we will overcome. We have.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Edwards. People are pouring in the comments just saying that this was, a nice conversation, that they're, encouraged, that they're hoping for change and, again, hoping that the reality will be different for their children. So thank you so much. I'm so glad you could join with us tonight, and we look forward to working with you in the future. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Be sure to follow us on social media at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Like this video, leave a comment, and hit that subscribe button to be notified about our latest content.